Hello everybody, my name is Stéphane and welcome to the top floor of English speaking fluency development. It's called the iSpeakWell project and you've never developed English speaking better in your entire life. But if you'd like to take this language learning enterprise up to levels that no first language English speaker can understand with their tiny, shiny human brains, all you need for that is a consonant, vowel, or word, a diphthong, idiom, or tone, a sentence, paragraph, or glottal stop, really any kind of speech phone. Fill your speech up with some phrasal verbs I like shout out. And join me here for the finest English speech treasure, the intonation journey, the thing that makes all your speech better. It's called the simultaneous articulation, and it happens now. Go. Boy, oh boy, there's no better way to get rid of your hesitation and increase your speaking intonation in English. Let's get started with the new ideas about English speaking. So currently I'm drinking Earl Grey tea. I developed a love for it from the Star Trek, the Next Generation Starship Enterprise Captain Jean-Luc Picard's request for the stuff from the Enterprise's mess hall replicator. So let's watch this little clip here.
Tea, Earl Grey, hot.
Tea, Earl Grey, hot.
Earl Grey?
Tea, Earl Grey, hot.
Tea. Earl Grey, perhaps.
Tea, Earl Grey, hot.
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 Would you like some tea?
No.
I love the ending to that clip as well. Would you like some tea? No. The audience expects the guy to say, yeah, please, could I have some Earl Grey? You know, because that's how the video has been built. Every single thing is going to be Earl Grey, tea, Earl Grey, hot. Yes, could I please have some Earl Grey? And finally the character says, nah. So I drink Earl Grey tea. I'm sure many of you do too. I think it's a nice touch to a 90s TV program showing humans some 400 years into the future. I mean, it gives a small connection to the real world at the current time. Even now, it's quite a popular beverage. It's quite popular as a hot beverage. I mean, there are no moments like the one you see in the Star Trek series, in the Star Wars universe, so far as I can tell. Now, I just mentioned two cultural references that are kind of relevant. I mean, particularly for males, I guess. And that is Star Trek and Star Wars. So if you haven't seen either of these two these two movie series, I would suggest you start with Star Wars, A New Hope, and also Star Trek, the movie, and you might even go to the Star Trek TV series. That might even be better. Start with the original series with Captain Kirk and Spock, and then progress into the Next Generation with Captain Picard and Commander Riker and Data. There's all sorts of cool things, and you'll start to kind of hear from those movies, especially nowadays, a lot of references and throwbacks in people's speech to those TV shows. So for example, if I'm at a person's house, let's say I'm at my mother's house, and my mom says, Stephen, would you like to have a cup of tea? I would say, tea, Earl Grey, hot. And she would know kind of where that's from. Ha 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 ha. Because she also loves the Star Trek series. So she would know that I was referencing Jean-Luc Picard and I wasn't being some rude jerk, ordering her about. Tea, mother, give it to me now. I'm not doing that. I'm just saying tea, Earl Grey, hot, to kind of have a little moment of levity. Because remember, one of the things that you might also recognize, or you might begin to recognize, or at least suspect, is that English first language speakers are typically very visual speakers, right? We use a lot of visual metaphor in our speech, for example. And so when we reference back to a TV show or a movie, what we're doing with our listeners, we're allowing them to experience again for just that little tiny moment, the joy of watching, their favorite TV show or their favorite series from the past, right? So it gives them a moment of happiness. You have a moment of happiness, and therefore, boom, you both bond in this moment of happiness. Okay, so that's a reason for telling you about why I'm drinking Earl Grey tea at the moment. Let's talk a little bit about curriculum. Now, many of you have wondered what sort of curriculum the iSpeakWell project is following to help learners develop their speaking skills and confidence. Well, yes, of course, we're following a refined curriculum developed over a decade of English speech training experience in Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and North America. As we progress through our work with the podcast in the iSpeakWell project, we will identify lots of elements which are new and relevant to your specific speaking challenge. Will I outline it like in a classroom experience? For example, talking in a restaurant, talking at the movies, talking with parents, talking at the mall, talking about this function or that function. Nope. Instead, what we're going to do is provide you with the real world experience of developing your speech through exploration, discovery, trial, error, and eventual success. So what we're going to be giving you are not made up examples of English speech that some English teacher or curriculum writer has sat down at their desk and decided, oh, this is a good conversation. Hello, friend. How are you? I'm fine, friend. How are you? I'm good. That's good. Blah, 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 blah. These are very boring conversation types and styles. And when you get to the real world scenario, it becomes very difficult and often, a little bit shocking, when you discover that first language speakers, when they are talking with other first language speakers, do so in ways that are not really explained to you as second language learners of English in your classrooms, either in high school or elementary school, or even in college, right? So the real struggle that you have if you are in your home country and you are trying to develop your English speech is who do you talk with? And your teacher has something like 250 students to work with in a semester, right? And that's a lot of people. And it's really difficult for a teacher to be able to speak with you one-on-one and identify things that are interesting to you that you want to incorporate into your own voice, right? So what we're doing here is providing you with those samples. And we're saying, okay, here's a unique thing that we know at the advanced level learners of English do not do this thing, this tactic, for example, this ability to turn a phrase, to show humor, for example, or even to understand that element of humor, right? So these things don't typically come out of a classroom experience, and until you have a good amount of person-to-person experience with a first language speaker, it's really difficult to develop the awareness, all right, and then to know that you're allowed to put it into your own speech. So that's what we're about here. We're showing you, look at this, listen, observe. Here's what the impact is. Now here's how you put it into your speech, right? So we're giving you the real world experience of developing your speech through exploration, through discovery, through trial, through error, and then eventual success, right? Because sometimes you will not know, or you will not put into action the thing that you learned correctly the first time. It will take a little bit of trial and error to eventually hit it just right. So this process will impact you much more than just your ability to string words together into grammatically correct sentences. So grammar is but one means of expression in a language. So we'll also be discussing logic, persuasion, cultural elements, vocabulary, grammar, and voice elements, as well as techniques for expressing ideas compactly. So as you get used to my voice, you will begin to see the speech on my face more easily. This makes you better able to read your fellow speaking partner's language, as well as to hear it, deploying your visual memory. As you shadow my voice, you will become accustomed to the way your body vibrates with the speech you are producing, and you will feel more relaxed, more calm, and more capable, because you will understand the energy of the speech better. Your thinking while speaking will clarify as you release more resources from techniques blocking your growth and expressiveness to focusing on becoming a visual speaker with a unique speech character. So we'll revisit this idea pretty much every podcast. However, our goal is to bring you a training experience which enables you to develop your language using the iSpeakWell project platform and its tools. Currently, the platform is set up on a small installation capable only of handling a few individuals using it. As we grow our listening base, we will be expanding to bigger and more powerful server architecture and make it possible for you not only to hear our speaking fluency ideas, but to practice them and gain immediate feedback, which you can action to improve speech fluency. Additionally, as we develop, an actual AI speaking partner will be embedded into the iSpeakWell project platform, with whom you can hold and develop thoughtful conversations to grow your speech character. Now, recall that this is called the iSpeakWell project. It's not the iReadWell or the iVocabularyWell or the iWritewell or the iGrammarWell project. We are focusing on speaking to the exclusion of any meaningful discussion about reading, writing, listening, vocabulary, grammar, or any other element. These are covered strongly in your regular English classes and in other places across the internet. However, there is not a speaking fluency training approach available which adult learners can follow and realize real results. To that end, we could care less about other skill development. Yet, we will bring some minor discussion about these other modalities into our speech practice periodically. Having a good speaking voice can strongly improve both your reading and writing as well as your listening capacities. We can see that the reverse is not true of the other modalities. This is because we typically view language in other modalities as forms of speech. Speech codified into written form for storage, for example. Language written in a poem or a play are the voice of the character or the writer. Laws are the voice of the ruler in whichever form. We imagine speech when we hear speech, and we imagine speech when we see written text. That it is written or an audio tract makes no difference. All language you experience in your learning journey emerged first from speech. Somehow, speech has become the last modality most learners develop. There are lots of good reasons: fear, learning approach, etc. So our curriculum is a simple one. Open your mouth and say something. Don't add anxiety energy to it. Just say it. Then say it again, perhaps a little differently, and think about how the words will impact the hearer. Will the hearer be persuaded? Will they believe you? Will they fear you? Will they fall in love with you? Will they side with you? Will they be your friend? Will they harm you? The words you hear will have an impact, and so you must develop your voice, words, tone, rhythm, etc., so you can control the impact and get the thing you are aiming towards. First language speakers of English are not worrying about their grammar or yours, except where there may be errors needing clarification. They are listening to the impact your words will have on their own daily mission. So any curriculum will be focused predominantly on speaking fluency development with the aim of helping you to develop meaningful tactics to express your ideas clearly and effectively without the worry and anxiety of grammar and vocabulary or other pretend problems. Speak without anxiety. That's our curriculum. We'll provide you with countless examples which we'll discuss, and you will gain a much deeper understanding of speaking fluency. So much so that you will desire to speak so strongly any previous kind of error you might have had will lose all relevance to your speaking goal, and you'll just stop worrying about it. So I know we're a little far into today's podcast, but I wanted to give another shout out to Scott Adams for his amazing podcast openings, which really do quite a bit. And I'm utilizing some of those techniques now to help you ease into English speaking practice. So you see what I did there? I used the phrasal verb shout out, right? So we shout out, "Hey, Scott, thank you so much." But let's talk a bit about something Scott Adams did as a technique in English speech that you'll need to know about if you already don't. It's called developing a CYA policy. So a CYA policy, CYA stands for cover your ass. And of course, this is a way of protecting yourself, okay? So a CYA policy is a personal policy to protect yourself from some kind of bad occurrence. Now, it's typically a legal repercussion that you want to protect yourself against. So, for example, if you're a public figure and you say a certain thing and your audience listens to you and they follow your words, you might be, quote, liable, end quote, for their actions, right? If they've lost money, for example, you might have to repay the money or a portion of the money they lost, especially if it's a class action lawsuit. Oh my God, that could be huge. So you want to be careful about. So Scott develops a CYA policy, and I want to play the section. Now, I'm going to play you about a minute. It's going to seem a little bit. I'm going to play about a minute, and then I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to finish off what his CYA policy is. And let's see if you can figure it out as we go along, or as he goes along, and then we'll talk about it.
It's like that in Israel. All right, I'm going to make a prediction that you want to hear. You probably already heard that the NASDAQ is down 20%. So that would be, a big drop. The other exchanges are not down 20%, but they might be. Now, here's what I think is going to happen. I'm going to give you the persuasion psychology take on this. This is not investment advice. Whatever you do, do not see this as investment advice, but it is a prediction. And the prediction goes like this. The reason the stock market's down is that so many people don't know what's going to happen. And they're just taking money off the table. They don't want to risk it. But as soon as you know what's happening, things will go up. But here.
Okay, so that's a good chunk of his prediction. Now, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to the rest where he kind of finishes it off.
20%, and that will be the bottom. I think that's what the bottom will be. But don't make any decisions based on that.
All right. So I wonder if you can kind of guess what it was that he did to produce a CYA policy there. So in the first point he says he's going to make a prediction. And as soon as you hear the word prediction in English, you should immediately think that there's a percentage that the prediction will be right and a percentage that the prediction will be wrong. For example, 50-50 could be a good prediction, for any potential event, and that's about the percentage of prediction for randomness, for example. It turns out chimpanzees have a predictive ability in certain tasks at 67%, and we'll kind of see how that works later in another episode, I think, because that particular video from which that statistic comes from is really, really interesting. And the speaker, he's a second language speaker of English, is really, really interesting and unique in his development. Yeah, in 2006, Hans Rosling actually gives you the best stats you've ever seen, and he actually pegged chimpanzees, in tasks where they have skill at like 67%, and then he asks the audience to ask certain multiple choice questions, at which I think the average was around 50% for the audience, but the chimpanzees got like 67%. Anyway, so a prediction has a certain percentage that will be right and a certain percentage that will be wrong. And as Scott goes into his prediction, he pauses for a moment and he wants to say that, they might be not here. What I think is going to happen, I'm going to give you the persuasion psychology take on this. And then he says, this is not investment advice. In other words, if you take the following words that Scott speaks and you act on them, then it is your fault, because he said clearly, this is not investment advice, right? Remember I said in the last episode that English is a speaker responsible language. Okay, so if the speaker says something and the hearer does something based on the speaker's words, and the hearer gets it wrong, there's a good chance that the reason why it was wrong is because the speaker did not speak correctly. So in Scott Adams' case, because he's talking about in the NASDAQ and he's talking about, the stock market going down and people are investing money and whatever, he wants you to understand that he's only predicting, he's not giving you investment advice. And so because of that, anything that you do thereafter is your own fault. And so he gives his spiel, blah, 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 blah. And then he does this tactic called doubling down. And he says, but don't make any decisions based on that. So in other words, for everything he might have said in the investment world that may or may not have been appealing to you, John Q. investor, right? If you act on those words, because at the beginning I said it's not investment advice, and at the end I said don't make any decisions based on that. In other words, the words I just spoke, not me, Stéphane, but Scott Adams, the podcast host. So if you do, your fault. And any judge would look at that and say, did you follow this as if it was advice? You did? Your problem. Did you follow this as if it wasn't advice? Your problem. Because Scott Adams protected himself with a CYA policy. He told you at the beginning, this is not investment advice. And at the end, he said, don't make any decisions based on that. And if you ignored that, then you're out. Your problem. So your lawsuit would not go far if you decided to sue anybody who properly provided a CYA policy to anything which might be construed as investment advice, So anyway, that's important. These are important. And you'll find that the stock market is not the only place where a CYA policy will be required. And we'll talk more about that later. So we're going to move over to a little bit of conversation from podcaster Candace Owens. And Candace Owens' podcast begins in an interesting way and continues on for quite some time in the same vein, where she describes why she's opened the podcast the way she has. She is expressing strong emotion in her podcast conversation about various topics, but all focusing on how others are apparently talking about her in relation to these topics. For some reason, the public conversation outside the podcast is causing Candace to utilize interesting speaking tactics like voice tone and punching certain sounds. So what I mean by punching certain sounds, so consonant sounds are useful tools, for example. For example, a T sound is this, t. But if I punch it, it's this, t. A K sound is this, k. But if I punch it, it's this, k. Right? So you kind of get a sense. A sound is a normal sound. And let's take a look at the impulse meter here so you can see in the impulse meter there is a white jagged line that seems to be emerging from this red bar here, or red line. And you can see that as my voice is strong, there is a peak, and when my voice is silent, there is a valley. So if I hit a consonant, k, you can see what happens. If I punch it, k, you can see there's a higher peak. T, 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 d, g, g, v, v, f, f, s, s, w, w, right? So for every one of those consonant sounds that I just gave you, you can see there's a lower peak and then there's a higher peak where I punch it. Now a punch is where you throw your fist out, but that's a metaphor for what we're doing with the voice. We're throwing the voice out. We're really making a strong v, and that's like a punch. T, d, k, pow, 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 with my fists of voice, right? So that's a tactic that you can use when you're expressing certain kinds of emotion. So we've queued it up to the right place here in Candace's speech. So as you listen, right, so Candace spells out a bit of viewer logic, which may be a bit of a truth and may be a bit of a straw man argument, right? Without additional knowledge, we don't know quite what to believe. She seems like a nice person, right? But she could be telling a lie. And in English culture, we must leave it as an open question when we don't know quite how to judge an individual. So if we rush to judgment without additional information, we may mischaracterize the whole situation and everyone within it. And we want to avoid that. So let's take a listen to this now.
Not going to hook me, okay? Question me for my deeds and my actions. You don't get to tell me that what Bianca Sensori is wearing is something that I have to speak out. Or, oh my.
Okay, so I've miscued that a little bit. Let's back it up here to the right place, and let's see where we are. 4151 here. Right there. Is that it? No, that can't be right. All right, we're properly cued. Here we go.
Maybe Candace is actually a pimp with Andrew Tate. This is what they've got. So you want to know why I don't respond when they ridiculously demand that I answer for Kanye, how Kanye West's wife is dressing? Because it's a nonsense. It means you have nothing left. You have nothing left to attack me with when you are now going, Kanye's wife ate a salad. Candace says she hates salad, so she needs to explain and answer for why his wife is eating a salad. No, I don't. You're not going to hook me, okay? Question me for my deeds and my actions. You don't get to tell me that what Bianca Sensori is wearing is something that I have to speak out. Or, oh my gosh, 27,000 articles are going to be written. You're all frauds. You are all frauds. And you're going to get exposed. I'm telling you, one by one, you're going to get exposed because you're pissing me off now, okay? I spent all of 2024 having to fight you guys.
All right. So, right, she's really struggling, and we can hear, as she's talking, she's saying things like, means you have nothing left. You have nothing left. You have nothing left to attack me with when you are now going, Kanye's wife ate a salad. Candace says she hates salad, so she needs to explain and answer for why his wife is eating a salad. Right. And so quite in that little stretch there, we get the opposite of punching the sounds. In the earlier section, Candace is actually a pimp with Andrew Tate. This is actually what they've got. Do you want to know why I don't respond when they ridiculously demand that I answer for Kanye and how Kanye West's wife is? Right? So she's really hitting all of those consonant sounds. But then when she really gets to the ridiculous part, and we saw this with Elon Musk in the last episode when, he was talking about, and then I have to divide things, because the spaceship is over there, right? And you can hear the elongating of the vowel sound. That's the opposite of the punching the consonant sound. And they're both used to signal often that the person who's speaking is, what did you answer? Is she happy? Is she sad? Is she giddy? Is she depressed? Or is she angry? Well, if you listened all the way to the end, she actually says that she's pissed off, right? And we remember that being pissed off means that she's angry, right? So she's hitting those consonants, and then she's turning around and she's elongating those vowels. Kanye's wife ate a salad. Candace says she hates salad. And she does that again. She says, I have to speak, or oh my gosh, 27,000 articles are going to be written, right? So she's elongating those vowels as well to show some kind of ridiculous situation. And so we can kind of see what that logical, ridiculous situation is. For example, Candace Owens is a podcaster. She's very popular in the conservative world, and she is often attacked by non-conservative people for some of her views. And, she's like any other human being. She has views, and she's like any other podcaster. She expresses those views, and she's an American, so she feels like she has the right to express her views because in America there is something called the First Amendment, which says that, speech shall not be abridged. In other words, you will not prevent somebody from being able to speak their ideas, right? So here there is, and there, in this example, Kanye's wife ate a salad. Candace says she hates salad. And here's the end to that logical pair. So, right? She needs to explain and answer for why his wife is eating a salad. Okay? And, that's part of the ridiculous situation. And Candace, verbally puts her foot down. No, I don't. Right? And then she says, she uses an interesting metaphor. You're not going to hook me, okay? Right? So the verb hook, to hook someone, a person, you can kind of think of in this world, this visual language world, we're now imagining perhaps Candace is like a fish, right? And a hook, it catches her and pulls her out of the water, right? Where she's comfortable in the water. Now she's out of the water and terrible things will happen, right? As the metaphor is supposed to go. And she's saying, no, you're not going to hook me, right? And then she follows up. She says what you can do. You can say, question me for my deeds and my actions. So her deeds and her actions can also be her words, right? If she speaks, then her speech is a deed. It's an acted out deed, and it's an action, right? You don't get to tell me that what Bianca Sensori is wearing or something that I have to speak or blah, 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 blah. So she's saying, look, you don't get to tell me what I get to talk about. Because that's basically the same as censoring somebody, right? Taking the words out of their mouth and replacing them with some other kinds of words. And regardless of whether or not you like Candace Owens, you gotta give her kudos for, the strength that she displays in her podcast. She is not taking any guff. Right? She doesn't care about how many people have ridiculous ideas about her. She is herself, and she is not going to change for anybody else, right? And she's telling people, look, you're pissing me off, okay? And you guys are all frauds, basically. So she's got an idea about a certain segment of her viewership, and she has a sense that, some of my viewers are trying to do things with my podcast that I don't want to do, and you don't have the right or the power to make me do something that I don't want to do with my podcast. Okay, so there it is. So moving over from the Candace Owens podcast to Smarter Every Day, where we see Destin, the host of Smarter Every Day, engage in lots of really interesting science experiments just to do things that he's really interested in. We see a different kind of excitement in voice, expressed not just with his voice, but with his body, using gesture to support his speech. So we're going to look at the first minute of this video. And in this video, we're talking about the impact of one thing into another and something interesting that seems to happen. And as an example, or actually as a precursor to this video, in another video that Destin and his team produced, a supersonic baseball essentially provided the genesis for this video here. And so we'll see what's happening in just a sec. So we're all queued up, and now we're just going to listen.
I'm very excited about this video because it's something I've been wanting to learn for years. Have you ever noticed when you have two things flying very, very fast and they impact in slow motion, that little spot right there where they touch for the first time, there's often a little flash of light. And it looks different at different times, but it's there, and we don't really know what it is. So today's video is all about that. We're going to do experiments here in the garage. We're going to see things that we've done in the past. For example, years ago, some friends of mine and I, we built a supersonic baseball cannon, and we saw it then.
No. Hold on. Am I seeing fire? Oh, there's fire!
Oh my gosh!
There's fire!
That was unexpected. Where's fire?
That is
seriously
fire.
like striking a match.
Okay, so some really interesting things going on in Destin's videos, and I really love how he builds these, right? Because he's really interested in some unique, very small thing that's hard to notice, right? And here it is, we can see it's the flash of the supersonic baseball through the glove, and we can see that happening. The baseball goes through, we see the slow motion, and then at the moment of impact, there's a tiny little flash. And then we notice something about, first of all, we can see Destin's body position as he's focused on the computer screen in front of him. And then we can hear his excitement because we hear a crescendo in his voice. No, 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 no. There's fire. There's fire. Right? And we hear his voice getting louder with the repetition, right, of the word or the idea, right? And we hear a kind of happiness or giddiness kind of suffuse or infuse the words, right? So that gives the words a different kind of energy. So for example, if we go back to the very beginning and you imagine if Destin had spoken like this. Have you ever noticed when you have two things and they impact in slow motion, they touch for the first time and it looks different at different times and we don't really know what it is. So today's video is all about that. We're going to do experiments here in the garage. We're going to see things. For example, some friends of mine and we built a supersonic baseball and we saw it then. No, 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 no. There's fire. There's fire. That was unexpected, right? So imagine if that was his vocal energy. How interested would you be to listen to his conversation, to his discussion, right? But then notice that he does something a little more, right? He breaks the idea down into smaller, digestible moments. Have you ever noticed when you have two things and they impact in slow motion, touch for the first time, right? So you hear there's a kind of bracketing pause around pairs of words. So listen to this again. Listen to it again with the volume on.
I'm very excited about this video because it's something I've been wanting to learn for years. Have you ever noticed when you have two things flying very, very fast and they impact in slow motion, that little spot right there where they touch for the first time, there's often a little flash of light. And it looks different at different times, but it's there and we don't really know what it is.
Okay, so you can hear that. Have you ever noticed when you have two things flying very fast and they impact in slow motion, they touch for the first time, right? We hear him bracketing. He's excited. Look at his hand movements. Look at his gestures as he describes the thing that he's talking about. His hands are pointing back and forth. He hops up and down. He's pointing about two things. Look at the color of his face. His eyes focus on the thing and then the camera, and he's looking at the thing in between the 2 points, and there's a flash, right? So he's animating that bit of speech in real time with his hands. His words, his gestures are matching what his words are saying. And you can see that his body contains a kind of excited energy. And it's not a negative excitement. It's a positive excitement. He really loves this thing that he's explaining. He really wants to explain it to you, and he wants to show you there, that point right there. Have you ever seen that? Let's look at 1,000 examples of it. Here, here, and here, and here. Here's one I did with a baseball going supersonic speeds. No, 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 no. There's fire. There's fire.
I'm very excited about this video because it's something I've been wanting to learn for years. Have you ever noticed when you have two things flying very, very fast and they impact in slow motion, that little spot right there where they touch?
That little spot right there, right? And you can see how his fingers circle around that little spot. Now, visually, in your mind, you should be constructing the same idea as he's explaining it, right? That should be there. And the reason why he's slowing down his speech that little bit is because, and encapsulating pairs of words, ideas, is because he wants you to be able to put that image in your visual memory, because later on you'll see example after example where he's taught of the thing that he's actually talking about. It's actually a lot cooler than that.
For the first time, there's often a little flash of
I love the way that he undersells that. A little flash, and his hands make this boom, kind of almost an explosion motion. But you can see he's not unhappy, he's not mad, he's not sad, he is excited. I can't wait to show you this. Let's go.
of light. And it looks different at different times, but it's there, and we don't really know what it is. So today,
It looks different at different times, right? So there's differences in each strike, and then he really highlights, but it's there. I'm telling the truth. You must believe me. I'm gonna show you.
today's video is all about that. We're going to do experiments here in the garage. We're going to see things that we've done in the past. For example, years ago, some friends of mine and I, we built a supersonic bass.
Did you catch, by the way, how he said that when he introduced the people around him? He said, some friends of mine and I. He didn't say, I and my friends, or I and some of my friends. He's put his friends before himself, and that's a signal. We do this in English as first language speakers to show respect for the person that we're with. I respect you so much, I will mention you first in the situation when we are together and I'm explaining what we did later on to another person.
Baseball cannon, and we saw it then.
No. Hold on. Am I seeing fire?
I like that. A no, right? So it almost sounds like he had a question and the answer was going to be no, and at exactly the same time he noticed something. No. A no. No. Right? And he repeats that again like, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Did we get it? No.
Oh, there's fire?
And you can see in his face, there's like his muscles in his face are really tense as he's got a huge, exuberant smile and he's trying to say the words fire. And his diaphragm and his rib cage are all tight with excitement and he's trying to verbalize, right? He's trying to get the words out.
Gosh,
There's fire.
And then that last one, you can hear the downtone. There's fire. There's fire, right? As if the realization is made into fact. And of course, here we see again
Unexpected.
the fact of it that just moments before, and I'm going to have to go back a second, right? We saw that little flash of the fire, right? So that's pretty cool. That was unexpected. I never really expected to see that. And in fact, in the same episode, we see the baseball not only creates a flame or fire as it strikes a glove, which is interesting because both of them are leather, right? The leather baseball glove and the leather baseball, when they make contact, they're not like flint and steel, right? Or something like that, or a bullet and steel. They are leather, why would there be fire? That's kind of exciting, right? So why wouldn't Destin be excited? And then he actually, as you can see in his video, and you can grab the URL here. As a matter of fact, if you grab that URL and you just go to YouTube, youtube.com, and you put it into the search, right? There it is. That's the video.
Dairy-free bacon.
Nah, we don't need to hear the ad, but thank you very much. But this is the ad for, or this is the video, The Unsolved Mystery of Impact Flashes, Smarter Every Day. So you can actually get to this video by simply copying down or writing down the ID, the video ID that's inside the screen here. So, and then just go and watch the whole video yourself. Okay, thank you, Destin. Smarter every day. So now we turn back to the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and you ask me, Stéphane, why are we back with the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner? Did we not hear enough of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner? To which I respond, no, you have not yet heard enough of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Why? Because Coleridge uses a lot of really interesting devices in his poem that we use in everyday English. And one of them is using a simile to describe the fear that the character of the mariner has at looking around, and also the feeling of memorizing such a phrase and bringing it out in speech. And what I mean looking around, so the mariner finds himself in a place which, is kind of frightful. It's scary. So how do you describe your fear? How do you describe your happiness? How do you describe your anger, right? So if somebody's angry, we often say they blew their top, or, steam came out of their ears, or they turned bright red, or something like that, right? So, or they looked like a tomato, for example. These are ways that we can describe how a person looks. So, Coleridge goes pretty much about as far as a person can go, I think, to describe fear he felt when he was looking at, the other mariners who apparently died of probably dehydration, maybe even starvation, but most likely dehydration because they are becalmed, right? The ship has no wind in its sails, so it cannot move forward, right? It cannot sail without wind, and they will eventually run out of water. And when you run out of water, you will eventually die of dehydration, right? So that's not good. So what's interesting is that this is a kind of phrase that is unusual in its construction. That's one part. And the second part is it would also be unusual to try to memorize such a phrase, but people do memorize them, and they do bring them into their speech. And you'll often hear that in, let's say, academic writing. You'll see bits of poetry or plays that are used to punctuate a point that a writer is trying to make, right? And we see the same thing later on with another writer called Mary Shelley. So let's listen to what the mariner says here for a few seconds, and then we'll talk about that and we'll see it in another location.
And in its time the spell was snapped, and I could move my een. I looked far forth, but little saw of what might else be seen. Like one that on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread.
That is one of my favorite lines here. like one that on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Now, you're not going to bring something like that out into everyday speech, but you might kind of like say it to yourself, or maybe even say it to somebody else just for fun, but just listen to how this works. He says, like one. Now, one means a person, right? Often male, but could be female. Like a person, like one that on a lonely road, a road that is lonely. Lonely meaning no other person to talk to. You are all alone. And what is that feeling of being all alone, not seeing somebody for a long time? So you're on a road. The road is lonely. And you are that person. That person walks on that lonely road in fear. That's that feeling of being scared. Oh, anxiety is part of fear. And dread is kind of like the level up from fear. When you dread something, you fear a bad thing is going to happen, right? And having once turned round, I like that that construction, and having, the gerund construction, or we could say the present participle, and having once turned round walks on. The person who's scared just once turned round, but now walks on and turns no more his head. So he doesn't turn back. He looked one time. That was enough. I'm not turning back. Why? Because he knows. There's something he knows. He turned his head back. He saw something. He knows. A frightful fiend. A fiend is a bad person. Somebody who means you ill. A frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. So doth is an older form of does, right? He knows a frightful fiend does close behind him tread. Okay, so when you see doth, you can think of does. Close behind him tread. Now a tread is another way of saying step. Right? Your tread is your footsteps, right? A person treads across the floor, they're walking across the floor. So we imagine, right, in this particular case, the mariner is describing the fear he has is similar to what one would experience if they were walking down a lonely road, right? And they turn around and they see a scary person behind them very close. They turn their head back and just keep on going, and they don't look back, because if they do, they're gonna get got. Right? And that's a kind of anxiety that's being described. And as you hear the words in your mind, you have a mental picture of the one person walking down the road. The road is lonely. It's probably dark. There's probably fog. There's probably very little around. No buildings, just this road. Maybe some light here or here. Maybe only moonlight or starlight. But there's a person over there, and oh my God, they look scary, and they're really close, and they're gonna get ya. Right? So these are all different ways that we can use. So this is a poetic way that we can describe what we feel. And Mary Shelley was so taken with this description that she actually used it in her own publication called Frankenstein. So Mary Shelley, through the characters she's writing, narrates how the character walks through the street. And you're going to hear something really interesting. So The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was written in 1700 and something, and Mary Shelley was published in 1818. So there's a kind of difference, I think, of around 20 to 25 years between when either one was published. But listen carefully to how Mary Shelley narrates Frankenstein here.
I continued walking in this manner for some time, endeavouring by bodily exercise to ease the load that weighed upon my mind. I traversed the streets without any clear conception of where I was or what I was doing. My heart palpitated in the sickness of fear, and I hurried on with irregular steps, not daring to look about me. Like one who on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Continuing thus, I came at length opposite to the inn at which the various diligences and carriages usually stopped. Here I paused, I knew not why, but I remained some minutes with my eyes fixed on a coach that was coming towards me from the other end of the street.
Okay, so in that stretch there, we can hear two different kinds of voice, right? We hear the narrated prose language. Now, prose is, when you read most fiction, right, it's written in prose. When you read Shakespeare, right, there's some prose, right? And there is a lot of poetic language. So in this particular area here, Mary Shelley actually borrows from Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and uses exactly the same stretch, the same phrase, which I found was kind of interesting. And what's interesting as well is if you listen to the difference between prose and the poetry, you can actually hear what type of language it is. So here, let me read it for you so you can kind of hear some of that difference. I continued walking in this manner for some time, endeavoring by bodily exercise to ease the load that weighed upon my mind. I traversed the streets without any clear conception of where I was or what I was doing. My heart palpitated in the sickness of fear, and I hurried on with irregular steps, not daring to look about me. Like one who on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Continuing thus, I came at length opposite to the inn at which the various diligences and carriages usually stopped. Here I paused, I knew not why, but I remained some minutes with my eyes fixed on a coach that was coming towards me from the other end of the street. So you can hear, even as I speak the words here, that I shift my speech into kind of a poetic approach. And the reason why is because the poetry is written in stanzas, and stanzas have a certain length, and the length is dictated by the number of syllables typically. And oftentimes you'll find that lines will often rhyme, meaning that certain endings of certain words, either one after the other or one over the next one, right? So let's say the first and second or the first and third might actually be our rhyming example. We'll often hear that and we'll often pronounce that, right? So for example, in this particular section, we have dread, head, and again, we have tread, right? So dread, head, and tread. Doth walk in fear and dread, right? And turns no more his head. Doth close behind him tread. When we hear that, remember we were mentioning that before, when we hear three things dread, head, tread. We love it. 3 things that rhyme. The rule of 3s, right? But then at the same time, we have, they are 3s, but they're 3 different things, right? But those 3 things also have the same sound. Ed, dread, head, tread. So, it kind of gives us an idea that we should do something different. Now, the other paragraphs that were read out, the narrative, it doesn't have the same kind of features. Sentences can be short, they can be long, they can have many syllables or a few, and so you can hear that there is a big difference between them. But the thing that you can kind of hear in this case, and what I wanted to point out to you from even our last podcast, which is when you hear something and you like it, you can use it in your speech. Here, Mary Shelley copied Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines. But then she attributes those lines to Coleridge. She's saying, they're not mine. I borrowed those because I felt that the way Coleridge talked about the fear of walking down the street and having fear was much better than I can do it. And, he's kind of narrating exactly the feeling that I have, so I may as well just put his words here, right? And, I'm just not going to try. I mean, I like Mary Shelley, but I think it might also be a shout out to Coleridge, because apparently Coleridge visited her father. What was her father's name? William Caleb, I think. I can't remember. Or Caleb Williams. Anyway, might be the wrong one. Maybe it's the writer of Caleb Williams. I can't remember. Anyway, he went to her father's house around the time when he was actually performing the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, right? He had just published it, and so he was going around place to place, and apparently she was influenced by him to become a writer. And, she wanted probably, I don't want to put words or ideas in her mind, but I would guess that the reason why she put that into her story at this point was to pay homage to the poet who had first gotten her involved in, poetry in the first place, or writing in the first place. Now I want to come to a longer stretch. And this stretch comes from the climax of the film, or maybe the pre-climax of the film, The King's Speech. And in this speech, or in this movie, we have Lionel, who is a speech therapist, and King George, or the Duke of York, I believe is his official title, who is about to become King George the Third, or fourth, or fifth. I can't remember how many kings there are. King Georges there are anyway. But he's about to become King George, and because he has a speech impediment, and you'll hear this in the clip, he has a speech impediment called stuttering. And stuttering, it presents a little bit differently for every person. But you'll hear that stuttering not only affects how you're able to deliver your ideas, but it also has an internal effect on yourself as the speaker if you're somebody who stutters, right? So there's an anxiety that gets built up around the idea of having to speak. Now, in this particular case or clip here, Lionel is actually being confronted by the king because it has been discovered that Lionel is not, quote, qualified. Okay, so there will be a little bit of language that you'll hear. For example, the Star Chamber Inquisition. The Star Chamber Inquisition, apparently the Star Chamber was apparently a room in the Tower of London or some castle somewhere where people would go to answer questions of the king, and they called it an inquisition because, you know, to inquire, you're being asked questions and you're in the Star Chamber, so it's called the Star Chamber Inquisition, and you're before the king, so it's even more Star Chamber Inquisition-y. Right? So we see the king is questioning Lionel's qualifications and also his loyalty, right? And goes even so far as to say that he would call him a fraud or have him arrested for fraud, right? And Lionel has to defend himself very clearly. Just like we saw with Candace Owens. You can say this, you can do that. I will do this, I will do that, right? And Lionel does not let the king put words or ideas into his mouth that other people might have put into the king's mind about Lionel. So Lionel has to uncover what are the lies that are being told and clarify what he's doing so the king can understand in a very clear way. But it goes even further than that because, you know, we see that Lionel is a highly, highly skilled instructor. And I wonder if you can actually pick up what he does and how he does it to get the king not only not to fire him or arrest him for fraud, but potentially keeps him on for life just because of this moment. Okay, so we're going to take a listen to this clip. Now, it's a little bit long. It's 4 minutes and 15 seconds, right? And we'll hear it through one time, and then we'll hear little bits and pieces of it again and again and again. But there's a certain message that you should take out of this for yourself as a second language speaker of English, and especially since you are developing your speech fluency just like the king is trying to develop his speech fluency.
Everything all right? Let's get cracking.
I'm not here to rehearse, Dr. Logue. Call me Lionel. Two of you. Never called yourself Doctor. I did that. For you. No training, no diploma, no qualifications, just a great deal of nerve.
The Star Chamber Inquisition, is it?
You asked for trust and total equality.
Bertie, I heard you at Wembley. I was there. My son Laurie said, Dad, do you think you could help that poor man?
What, as a failed actor?
It's true. I'm not a doctor. And yes, I acted. A bit. Well, I recited in pubs. I taught elocution in schools. When the Great War came, all our soldiers were returning to Australia from the front. A lot of them shell-shocked, unable to speak. Somebody said, Lionel, you're very good at all this speech stuff. Do you think you could possibly help these poor buggers? I did muscle therapy, exercises, relaxation, but I knew I had to go deeper. Those poor young blokes had cried out in fear. No one was listening to them. My job was to give them faith in their own voice and let them know that a friend was listening. That must ring a few bells with you, Bertie.
Give a very noble account of yourself.
Make inquiries. It's all true.
Inquiries have been made. You have no idea who I have breathing down my neck. I vouched for you, and you have no credentials.
You had lots of success. I can't show you a certificate. There was no training then. Everything I know from experience, and that war was some experience. My plaque says L. Logue speech defects, not doctor. There are no letters after my name. Lock me in the tower.
I would, if I could.
On what charge?
Fraud. With war looming, you've saddled this nation with a voiceless king. You've destroyed the happiness of my family, all for the sake of ensnaring a star patient you couldn't possibly hope to assist. It'll be like mad King George III. It'll be mad King George the Stammerer, who let his people down so badly in their hour of need. What are you doing? Get up! You can't sit there! Get up!
Why not? It's a chair.
No, that is not a chair. That is St. Edward's chair.
People have carved their names on it.
Chair is the seat on which every king
It's held in
and
place
queen...
by a large rock.
That is the stone of Scone. You are trivializing
you can
everything.
believe all that,
You
Bunkum. I
trivialize...
don't care how many royal arsenals have sat in
Listen
this
to me!
chair.
Listen to me!
Listen to you by what right?
By divine right, if you must. I'm your king.
No, you're not. You told me so yourself. You said you didn't want it. Why should I waste my time listening to
Because
you?
I have a right to be, and I have a voice!
Yes, you do. You have such perseverance, Bertie. You're the bravest man I know. You'll make a bloody good king.
So that's obviously a very powerful moment in the film, and it's often not the case that most learners will have such a realization about their own speech, right? So one of the things that I noticed living abroad, teaching in lots of different places, that second language speakers of English have kind of unreal expectations about what their English is. In fact, most of them say when I ask them whether they are beginner students or even the most advanced student, I could sit in my classroom and I could say to my students, how many people here speak English? And not one student will put their hand up. And I asked myself, well, why is that? Well, it's quite simple. It's because of a confidence issue. It's because the learners don't believe they speak English. Just like in this scene that we watched, we can see that Bertie, the king, doesn't actually believe he has a voice. And it's only by going through the crucible of difficulty that he finally realizes he not only has a voice, but he can use it at the same time. So we find in the play, or in the movie, at the beginning of the scene, that the king is seated, or he's not the king yet, the prince is seated in the chair, and we find out that this is St. Edward's chair. This is the chair that all monarchs in England sit in prior to and then becoming the monarch of England. They sit in that chair. It's like a throne, right? It's a special chair. So actually, at the beginning of the scene, the Duke is not, or the prince is not sitting in that chair. It's not until later on, but we do see that chair in the scene around, right? We question ourselves about what it is. And in the story, we find out that the qualifications of Lionel are in question. And we hear the king really struggle to enunciate, not pronouns, but to enunciate his words. We hear sounds like this. Right? It sounds like he's being choked. And so it's very clear at the beginning that he really struggles. But what do we discover? Why is he struggling? That's a question. He's a first language speaker of English. Now, obviously, he has a stutter. There's a kind of medical condition attached to it, and there are treatments that people undergo to resolve their stutter as best they can. It doesn't always go away for lots of people, but apparently it can be improved, I've heard. We discover that the big challenge here in the scene is that Lionel is discovered not to have a doctorate degree. And his justification for this is, first of all, this is the Star Chamber Inquisition, right? So he's framing it. He's saying to the king, okay, I know what's going on here. Let's speak frankly. And the next thing he says is Bertie. He calls him Bertie, right? He actually interrupts the king at that point as well, right? So the king says, you ask for trust and total equality. And you can hear him struggling, and then he gets cut off. He says, Bertie, I heard you at Wembley. I was there with my son, Laurie. He said, Dad, do you think you could help that poor man? You know, and of course, the king, we'll call him the king because he becomes the king. He comes back and he says, what, as a failed actor? Because, you know, that's where a lot of, you know, Lionel's experience comes from. You know, activities that he uses to train the king all come from, you know, activities that actors engage in to develop their voice so they can enunciate clearly to their audience. And he says, it's true. I'm not a doctor. He levels with the king. He doesn't try to, you know, protect himself. He doesn't try to, you know, defend himself. He bears himself. He opens himself up. He says, I'm not a doctor. And yes, I acted. And then he reduces it. He says, a bit. Well, I recited in pubs. So not even an actor on stage. He's a dude in the pub. This is a place where people go to drink alcohol. And he's reciting Richard III, you know, blah, 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 or Hamlet to be or not to be, you know, in a pub with other drunk people around. I taught elocution in schools, right? And then he comes to a big point. He says, when the Great War came. So the Great War is World War I, right? Now, at this time in the movie, we're entering into World War II, right? So when the Great War came, all our soldiers were returning to Australia from the front. Now, the front is the front line between one side of the army, one country's army, and the other country's army, right? So that's the front, right? When the Australian soldiers were returning from Europe, right? The front, a lot of them were shell-shocked, right? So psychological situation that happens, we call it PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's had lots of other names, but shell shock was one of those things. And one of the conditions that came out of being shell-shocked was being unable to speak. So he says, Lionel, Somebody said, Lionel, you're very good at all this speech stuff. Do you think you could possibly help these poor buggers? I love that expression, these poor buggers, because it basically takes them from high kings down to low, menial people. And then he talks about what he did with even those people. I did muscle therapy exercises, relaxation, but I knew I had to go deeper. And he comes to the deeper point that the king could even relate to. Those poor young blokes had cried out in fear. No one was listening to them. And then he says, my job, not my qualifications, my job was to give them faith in their own voice and let them know that a friend was listening, right? And that's what he basically did through the whole film, is he let the king know that someone was listening and gave them faith in their own voice. And he says, that must ring a few bells with you, Bertie, right? So to ring a few bells or to ring bells with somebody is to, well, like that should make you remember something, right? And that's an actual expression. Oh, you know what? That rings a bell. I think I remember, right? So that must ring a few bells with you, right? Or that must ring a bell or two with you, right? And of course, Bertie doesn't really believe him, or he's not fully convinced. He says, well, you make yourself sound really good. You give a noble account of yourself. And I love how he uses his language so economically. You give a very good account. You give a very noble account of yourself. He doesn't say, well, you say lots of really good things about yourself, and I don't believe this, and I don't believe that, and I think all of that is just overblown. He says, you give a noble account of yourself. Few words, there it is, right? And Lionel continues on. He says, go ahead, ask around, make inquiries. It's all true. Now, we're in an argument, so there's a back and forth, and the king says, inquiries have been made. You have no idea the pressure I'm under. And Lionel comes back. He says, the king says, actually, I vouched for you. In other words, I put my faith, I put my trust in you, and I told other people around, that guy there, he's my guy. He's helping me, right? He's qualified. And now I learn, you have no credentials. I vouch for you and you have no credentials. And Lionel replies immediately, but lots of success. I can't show you a certificate. There was no training. Everything I know from experience. And that war, punching back at the king, because in World War I, Australia went to fight to defend England and other countries against the Germans, right? And that war was some experience. My plank says L. Logue speech defects, not doctor. There are no letters after my name, right? So in other words, when you're a doctor, you might call yourself, Stéphane, what's my last name? Stéphane Silversmith, PhD, right? You might see something like that where the PhD is the doctorate, that's the letters after my name. And then when he sees that the king is still not fully moved or on his side, he says, lock me in the tower. Right? The Tower of London is where criminals or people who fell out of favor with the king would be put. Right? It's a prison. And the king says, I would if I could. Lionel fires back, on what charge? The king fires back his own riposte. Fraud. With war looming, you've saddled this nation with a voiceless king. And now he's really projecting at this point. I have no voice. The happiness of my family is going to be destroyed. You tried to ensnare a star patient. You couldn't possibly hope to assist because you've been only helping these menial jerks in Australia, an Australian, not even a British person, right? And then he comes to the real point. It'll be like Mad King George III, or rather, Mad King George the Stammerer, who let his people down so badly, right? And this is a thing that people do when they feel that their language is not up to par to other people. They beat themselves up over it, right? They don't recognize the effort they've put into it. They don't recognize that others are amazed or impressed with the effort that they've put into being able to be a speaker of whatever kind they are, right? And at this point, we hear the king really lamenting. It'll be like Mad King George III, or rather, Mad King George the Stammerer. And you can almost hear the tears, who let his people down so badly in their hour of need, right? You can almost feel the sadness that he's just emoting. And then he turns around and he sees Lionel in the seat. And what does he do?
Who let his people down so badly in their hour of need.
Whoa, there's Lionel in the seat.
What are you doing?
Now, there's a change. Do you hear it? The change in tone? It's not, what are you doing? It's, what are you doing? What are you doing? There's an edge. What are you doing? Right? Something has gone wrong. And the king is now enforcing not a law, but his title, right? The thing that must be. And now he's gonna make it happen. He has to.
Get up, you can't sit there, get up! Well,
Notice no stammer. Get up, you can't sit there, get up!
Oh, it's a chair.
No,
And Lionel, why not? It's a chair.
that is not a chair, that is St. Edward's chair.
Okay, so now there's a reason for why that's not just a chair, right? And as he's trying to explain this, you hear him choking a bit. That is St. Edward's chair. And then, of course, Lionel swats that away like a fly.
People have carved their names on it.
People have carved their names on it.
Is the seat on which every king
It's held in
and
place
queen...
by a large rock.
Of course, the king is really trying to justify why he can't sit there. Every king and every queen have sat on that chair. And he says, it's held in place by a large rock. Which it is. This St. Edward's chair has a large rock. This is the Stone of Scone, which comes from Scotland. And you can actually hear, like Shakespeare talks about the Stone of Scone, I believe, in, I think his play Macbeth. I think in the Scottish play, I think he might have mentioned it.
That is the Stone of Scone. You are trivializing everything.
You are trivializing everything. You trivialize. And then, of course, Lionel basically doesn't care.
I don't care how many royal assholes have...
And you can hear how their voices are working. The king's is going up, I don't care! And then Lionel's goes over top, I don't care how many royal assholes have sat in this chair. And the king still trying to win because he's got to, because look, that asshole is sitting in the royal chair. He can't sit there.
Listen to me! Listen to me!
Listen to how he tells him, listen to me, listen to me! And then, of course, Lionel bats that away.
To you by what right?
Listen to you by what right? You're not even king yet. You don't even want to be king.
My divine right, if you must. I'm your king.
No, you're...
Oh, the king actually gets in there. You can see the anger. It's seething out of him. By divine right, if you must, I'm your king. Right? And there's no hesitation. He is right on point, right? Remember, he stutters.
You're not. You told me so yourself. You said you didn't want it.
No, you're not. You told me so. No, you're not. You told me so yourself. You said you didn't want it. There's like 3 lines there.
Why should I waste my time listening to
Because I
Why should I waste my time listening to you?
have a right to be, and I have a voice!
Because I have a right to be. Because I have a voice. So, that's essentially the learning that Lionel has been trying to get the king to. But through some kind of circumstance that's built up through the way the movie is written, and even, it's based on a true story, life circumstances, there may have been some distrust at some point between the real King George and Lionel Logue. We don't quite know, or I don't know anyway. I should do a little bit more research on this point. But what we get to is Lionel is very, very clever to find this moment. Because not only is he on the precipice, he could be pushed out, right? But he also brings the king to this realization that he hadn't had before, which is, I have a voice.
Yes, you do. You have such perseverance, Bertie. You're the bravest man I know. You'll make a bloody good king.
Yeah, you'll make a bloody good king. So at the very end, what do we find? Lionel doesn't even have to tell him, boop, king, you've hit the point, you've hit the nail on the head, you understand everything I'm trying to tell you, you have a voice, you have the ability to express yourself, so do it, go and do it. You have such perseverance. You keep going and going and going. And he calls him not your highness, he calls him Bertie, the family name. You're the bravest man I know. Not you're the man who should listen to me. Not you're the man who should believe that I have qualifications. But you are the bravest man I know. And listen to that down tone. You're the bravest man I know. Then he says, the last line, you'll make a bloody good king. He doesn't say you'll make a good king. He doesn't say you'll make a great king. He says you'll make a bloody good king. And that expression is kind of like the highest level of, expression that he could possibly make at that point. I mean, it's a kind of a British expression as well, to be bloody good. Oh, bloody good, Certainly in North America, you don't really hear a lot of people say that. They'll say effing good, using the real words instead of effing, right? So that's one of my favorite films, The King's Speech, and you should watch it. I think you should watch it because you also see some kinds of activities that actors and actresses do when they are developing their voice for a role. Now, remember, different characters speak in different ways. And in fact, if you were to take a look at Pirates of the Caribbean, you'll find exactly the same actor, Geoffrey Rush, in Pirates of the Caribbean. So here we are. This is the same character, the same actor, but a different character.
I don't think in some areas you have to be very brainy to be a pirate. Unless you're Barbossa, I actually think he is quite smart, and that's probably why he survived. He's a horrible liar, and yet he pretends to be a gentleman of the sea, but he's a dirty old cunning rogue.
I agreed she'd go free, but it was you who failed to specify when or where.
Action! You sit down to read a blockbuster action pirate movie script with a certain amount of trepidation because you think, well, it's probably going to be only the romantic version of what that era might have been like. And in some ways it has to be that, because I do want 7-year-olds to be able to come and see it and go, that was cool. And yet at the same time you don't want it to be such a fairy tale that it doesn't kind of mean anything. We want the audience to have to keep making moral decisions. What would I do next? Part of the fun, I think, must have been the notion of brotherhood. If you were a pirate, you became a member of a very non-hierarchical boatload of people.
This might actually be a slightly better version of him speaking in character.
Davy dead already. I don't sound dead. Oh, is that so? Well, I hear nothing but seagulls nesting. Apologies, Your Majesty. Too long, my fate has not been in my own hands. No longer. It would strain credulity at that. It'd be too late to walk the course now, matey! Drop it!
So in some ways, this is kind of how a pirate talks. It be some way, matey. Ah, ha, 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 ha. You know, so it's interesting to listen to how the actor Geoffrey Rush kind of changes his voice. And in fact, if you watch the King's Speech with Colin Firth, you'll also recognize Colin Firth does not have a stutter. And so he modified his voice to bring out that idea so that we see or we can hear some of the changes. And these are things that you can do as well in your own voice. You can modify your voice so that you have your own English speech character, right? That's informed by everything you know from your first language and all the knowledge about the world that you have. But then you use the tactics of your voice. You use how you can open your mouth or, you know, tense your body up to change the dynamics of your voice. And you're doing that so you can express different ideas more clearly, different emotions with more clarity. Now, we're going to shift from one kind of media. This is the news media, movie or Hollywood media, to news media. And one thing that you should be clear about is that the news media partakes of exactly the same technologies and exactly the same kinds of approaches to speech delivery that that Hollywood does, right? So the news media has news anchors and, you know, all sorts of people who come on as guest speakers and whatnot. But the news anchors are trained actors and actresses, and the people come on are, quote, PR trained. In other words, they understand how media works, and they also understand how their voice should be used when they're discussing things on the airwaves. So we're going to listen to the first 16 seconds, and then we're going to jump ahead to the first minute mark there, about 54 seconds, and we're going to listen to the 1 minute and 34 seconds. And I want to compare and contrast the different voices that we hear. One is the main news anchor, and then the other is the actual person who is giving us the story. And there's a difference to how they use their voice, right? And there's something we should understand about news media. News media shouldn't be trying to influence, it should be informing. That's at least what, when I was in school, was the main role of the news media, was not to try to get you to vote one way or the other, or to buy one thing or the other, or to go somewhere or the other, but it is to be informed about what's happening around the world. And we kind of see that that's happening, but we also kind of hear something else. So let's listen to this and see what we get.
President Donald Trump is not backing down on sweeping tariffs as international markets plunge and American stocks continue to slide in reaction to the new taxes. Naomi Ruckham tells us what to expect from Washington this week as Americans fear a worsening financial crisis.
All right, and we'll pop ahead to the 54-second mark.
The European Union is now proposing a list of U.S. goods to hit with extra tariffs, which could send prices soaring for products like fast fashion, electronics, cheese, and champagne.
The costs of doing business with the United States will drastically increase. And what is more, there seems to be no order in the disorder.
Amid the uncertainty, Democrats say they have several Republicans and company CEOs on board to limit the president's power on tariffs.
I think we're hearing from a big segment of the economy. The consumer spending is a big part of GDP, and they're worried.
All right, so this is very interesting. There's 3 female speakers here, and there's nothing about being a female or male that will make this one thing or another. As a matter of fact, if they were males, you would probably hear exactly the same kinds of techniques that they're using. Now, one of the things that I hear at around the 8-second mark as the, we call them the news anchor. They're the person that the news camera comes back to during the show. You know, they're the one that keeps the through line of the news. And we hear the soft voice that she has. And then she comes to slide, right? And the use of her breathiness, as if there's a situation that's just barely keep myself from crying. How are we going to do it? Right? And that's kind of what I'm hearing. So the first word she says, President Donald Trump. Okay, so she uses the title. And then she says, is not backing down. As if he should. He's not doing it. He's not backing down on sweeping tariffs. Now, she could have said tariffs, but she said sweeping. Now, when you sweep, you have a broom and you put the sweep on the ground or the broom on the ground and you pull it towards and past you into another place and it collects all the dust, hopefully, along the way, and it grabs everything and it's a sweep, right? So sweeping tariffs as international markets plunge. They don't just go down, they plunge. Now, this is what we do when you jump into deep water. You plunge down, right? And American stocks continue to, they don't just go down, they slide in reaction to the new taxes. So the American stocks are standing there, just minding their own business. La, 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 la. We're American stocks having fun. La, 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 la. And then the new taxes come, and they're not taxes, they're tariffs, but they're calling them taxes. Taxes come, and the stocks slide. Oh my God, taxes slide in reaction. And then she says, Naomi Ruckus tells us, not just tells us the story, but tells us what to expect. Like, oh my God, this terrible thing is coming. What's it going to look like? How big is it going to be? Please, Naomi Ruckus, tell us. Oh, and I also love from Washington, right? Because that's the center of the universe. This week, now, present time, as Americans fear. They fear something. What do they fear? A crisis. What kind of crisis? A financial crisis. Oh no, what kind of financial crisis? A worsening financial crisis, right? And listen to how nicely, and also take a look at the image of the president here. This is the one that he posted when he first became the president, which has the eye. The eye is looking at you.
President Donald Trump is...
Nice soft voice. President Donald Trump
not backing
down
on sweeping
tariffs.
Tariffs as international markets plunge.
As international markets plunge.
American stocks continue to slide.
As American stocks continue to slide.
In reaction to the new taxes.
In reaction to the new taxes.
Naomi Ruckham tells us what to expect from Washington.
Naomi Ruckham. So sweet.
This week as Americans fear a worsening financial crisis.
As Americans fear a worsening financial crisis. And you can hear that pause. A worsening. And the audience is like, a worsening? A worsening what? Financial crisis. Oh no!
American and international markets have tanked and reacted.
All right. I love this. So she comes, well, we won't go to this point. We'll just go to 54 seconds here where she's talking. But there's a kind of tonality in her voice. Listen carefully.
European Union is now proposing a list of
European Union is now proposing a list of U.S. goods to hit with extra tariffs.
U.S. goods to hit with extra tariffs.
Extra tariffs.
Which could send prices soaring for products.
Which could send prices soaring. Not that prices are going to go up, but prices are going to soar like a bird so high in the sky.
Products like fast fashion, electronics.
For products like, what is fast fashion? Is that like fast food? Like you go to the mall and you get a shirt. Oh, I like this shirt. You buy it really fast. Right? Or what? Oh, and they said electronics, cheese. And look at these cheese wheels. Where are we getting those cheese wheels from? Like nobody buys cheese like that. They buy blocks of cheddar cheese from the grocery store, not these kinds of artisanal cheese. Like, look at this guy. He's sitting there with the cheese wheel and a hammer. What is he doing? Bump, bump, bump. Hammering it to check its ripeness.
Cheese and champagne.
And champagne. Ah! So Naomi Ruckham is telling us with her words that rich people products are going to go up with soaring prices. Dramatic increase. Right? Okay. Well, is that a problem? Why is it a problem? Why does she choose these words?
The costs of doing business with the United States will drastically increase.
Okay, and so we get, I think, the president or the prime minister, the president of the European Union saying... Yep, that's right.
And what is more, there seems to be no order in the disorder.
Okay, so she obviously speaks English as a second language, which is fine. There's no problem with that. And she says the cost of doing business, the costs, not just the cost, but the costs, like lots of costs that are associated with doing business with, and it doesn't matter which country, but with any country. But here she says the United States because we're dealing with the tariffs that have been put onto different countries. And she says the costs will drastically increase. Okay. Why does she say drastically? Who said drastically? Right? She's saying drastically, but I haven't heard everybody else say drastically. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. And she's saying they will, right? They have no choice. They will. And then she says, what is more? Which is to say, additionally, or also, and then she continues with this kind of weird statement. She says, there seems to be no order in the disorder. Okay, so the world of tariffs is disorder. In the disorder, there is no order. Now, I don't know about you, but here's a moment for some logical consideration here. Isn't the meaning of disorder to lack order? So she's saying that a situation of ordinary disorder is ordinary and it lacks order. What is she expecting here, right? I think she's just saying words to say words, right? I mean, she's just a shade off of Kamala Harris in this case. She hasn't really said anything here.
Amid the uncertainty, Democrats say they have several Republicans and company CEOs on board.
Uh-oh, so there is uncertainty. Amid the uncertainty. What is the uncertainty? Amid the uncertainty, Democrats say something. And they're saying that lots of Republicans and CEOs of companies are on board to do a thing. And the thing is, limit the president's power on tariffs. Okay? So, not sure how they could do that unless they go through Congress or some weird thing like that. I don't know. But I have this feeling that they're, again, just trying to say a thing. But there's also a lot of people who might speculate and say, oh, yeah, here they are trying to go outside of the power, of the, of the people or of their own party or whatever the case is. They're going to limit the president's power on tariffs. Okay, well, that might be the case. Let them go. Let them do. But nowhere here have they given a reason for why there should be a limit. And Naomi Ruckham finishes this way.
To limit the president's power on tariffs.
I think we're hearing from a big segment of the economy. The consumer spending is a big part of GDP, and they're worried.
Okay, so the last presenter, who I don't actually know who this person is. She's just somebody on Face the Nation. And she says, I think, which doesn't mean I know. It means I have an opinion in my brain. And opinions are informed by all sorts of, functions of the mind, worry, whim, right? Outright fabrications or even lies, as well as fact, right? When you believe or when you know something, it's typically got to be based in fact. But here she's saying, I think, which is opinion. We're hearing. So I have an opinion that we're hearing. Okay, that's a weird opinion to have. And the opinion is not that a big segment, blah, 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 is worried, but that she's hearing that a big segment is worried. Okay, well, that's fair. That's fine. The consumer spending is a big part of GDP. Is that true? Possibly. Possibly not. And she's saying, and they're worried. Consumer spending about what? Well, according to Naomi Ruckham, rich people things. Fast fashion, electronics, cheese, champagne. Consumers are worried. According to the last lady, they're not going to get those things. According to Naomi Ruckham. Interesting. So, you have to be aware of what's happening with the news media because they're not just presenting you with facts. You have statements which appear to be factual in nature, but they're quite often presented with emotions, emotionality, body position, posture, right? And the softness of the tone or the hardness of the tone. The first presenter is soft. The last presenter is soft. Naomi Ruckham has a harder edge to her voice, right? And we're supposed to be swayed by the emotions that we hear, not just the grammar, not just the vocabulary. In this particular case, we have a story where, Americans are facing what some people are terming a crisis, other people are terming as something else. It's a redevelopment, a new development in the way that, America does business. And some people are scared of what they see, and rightly so on a certain level. I mean, we heard from Elon Musk earlier, who is working with Doge to change how America spends, money, tax money, so that it's not fraudulently spent or it's not going to causes or people who should not be receiving it. And certainly he's worried because you hear in his voice as he's describing that, if I push too hard, then they could kill me, right? How am I going to go back to Washington? They could probably kill me, right? He's worried. He's anxious. So, we have, a whole group of people across the country who are worried because, for the first time in American history, debt is exceeding spending on other things, like, for example, the military, or a combination of things, right? And, a lot of Americans are worried. So if you think about who's worried, right? Now, of course, all of these people that we're seeing on television and who we're hearing from, they're kind, they're nice, they're all doing their job, the right job as far as they're concerned, right? But you got to think, or, as a listener, we think, okay, what is being affected? On one side, you have tariffs that are being brought out to bring, America more financial stability, to decrease the deficit, to decrease the debt, and to refinance, all of those things, with a lower interest rate. And on another side, you have some people who are afraid that they're not going to get cheap prices on fast fashion and electronics and cheese and champagne, which are rich people things, right? And you have another group of people who are just consumers and they're worried. And you have a group of people who are Republicans and CEOs and they want to limit the president's power. And that almost kind of sounds coup-like. I don't know, like a coup d'etat. Where people who are not the president try to seize presidential control and take over the country. Let's see what happens. But tone of voice is really important, and how we use our voice to signal the things that we want to happen, right, is really, really critical. Being aware of what those references are between different people who are talking and different events that happen are really, really important as well. And as we're working together, we're talking about all of those things and we're putting them together for you in a digestible format so that you can come back and you can listen and you can practice and you can start to develop your fluency more tightly and, more in consonance with, the culture of English, the grammar, the vocabulary, and all of those other little functions that you hear. All right. I'm so glad to hear you. Now, we are still looking for a couple of second language learners who are working hard to develop their speech fluency. We're looking for 2 adult English language learners, not young people. So if you know people who are working on their fluency and they want to gain some free fluency training by working with the iSpeakWell project, and I don't mean like a job, I mean kind of like, kind of like a class setting where we talk about challenges that the learners are having and they, gain some input from us in how to resolve those challenges. And from there, we gain some additional leads into topics that are really useful for second language learners to develop their speech fluency. All right. You guys are amazing. We'll talk to you again. Please click like and share to let other people know that you like this podcast, and let your friends who are studying English speech fluency know about the iSpeakWell project. And we're looking forward to seeing you again later. Take care, guys. Bye.